Good boy, Tucker.
Welcome, everybody.
Welcome.
Hey.
Welcome.
Work smarter where you want.
Consistency is key.
And remember, if it's not in Redtail, it never happened.
This is learning at its most fun.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in part one of our workflow series. Today, we're going to be covering whiteboarding and conceptualization. My name is Curtis Ware. I'm one of the trainers here. And the one different aspect of today's webinar than the other three are we are just conceptualizing. It's all theory talk today. We're not actually going to dive into the CRM at all. So today's goal is to cover everything that's involved in actually whiteboarding out your processes for the CRM itself to set up those workflows. So what a workflow is, or the process, it's a task management tool. It helps so you can actually automate your business practices. We like to say it's a good CYA application. And for any of you who knows what that is, it's a cover your assets. So we want to make sure that we're covering every aspect of our process. We don't want anything to fall through the cracks. We want to make sure that if somebody isn't able to come in and do their part of their process, that we have a way to make sure and capture that so we can make sure everything moves forward smoothly. And again, you get to automate everything. We have like important procedures, even just day-to-day to-do lists you can do. And today, again, we're going to be talking about just the whiteboarding aspect. So it's really important. Instead of just jumping into the CRM and starting to build out all your workflow processes, you really want to actually do the whiteboarding. And so let's go back here. What a workflow is. Workflow is a set order of events. So it's a process. So we can go step 1, step 2, and step 3. So we have certain orders. There's different keywords and different words that we're going to be using specifically in our database, and a step is one of those. So a step is originally designed to tell you what part of the process you're at. And so again, am I on step 1? Am I on step 2? Am I on step 3? And you get to actually customize all the step names, even the task names, to decide what you want. So we don't actually have to call it step 1. Just for this part, we're going to refer to it as step 1. Underneath the steps is you have your tasks. So the tasks are actually the action items telling you what needs to get accomplished to make sure that that step actually happens. All right, so if we have step 1, maybe we have like 3 different tasks under step 1. And then under step 2, maybe we just have 2 tasks or even like 7 tasks. And each step, again, has the actual multiple tasks that can actually give you the action items of what needs to get accomplished so that step can move forward into the process. The tasks themselves are who you assign ownership to. So who is responsible for each of those tasks? One of my favorite ways to describe workflows, especially when you're thinking about how do I start building them? Like, what is the actual difference between a step and a task? I always like to describe it like I have to run some errands, and I have to go to the grocery store, the hardware store, and the pet store. Those are 3 different locations. I can only be at one location at a time. So in this case, when I go to the grocery store, I then have a list of items I need to accomplish. So I need to get milk, eggs, bread, bacon, beer. I got to get those 5 items. In that instance, it doesn't necessarily matter what order I pick up those items in. I got to get 5 items. I'm at the store. I'm at the grocery store. I cannot go on to the pet store or the hardware store until I get all 5 items. So the items at the store are my tasks, and the store itself is the step, because I can only be on one step at a time. So when we go through and start whiteboarding, you want to think of that concept. All right. And so again, like when you go to the grocery store, I can assign out those different tasks to different people. So if I'm not the only one at the store, I can say, okay, my roommate's going to go get this task. I'm going to go get this task. The actual items in the grocery store, I do not have to wait for them to pick up their item before I can pick up mine. So it's sort of a divide and conquer. You can set up multiple tasks under one step, so you can divide and conquer that whole step to make sure everything gets accomplished. Now, when you set up your whiteboarding, you want to sit down with your office, all right, either with a piece of paper, a whiteboard. We're going to be using Microsoft Word just so you can digitally see what I'm doing. but you actually want to whiteboard the process. It's one of the most important aspects because, again, like I said, you don't want to just jump into the CRM and start building. You want to know what your roadmap is going to be. You need to map everything out so you know where you're going to go, what direction you're heading in. Once you go in that, you always want to start with in a perfect world. In this case, most of the time, if we have a 3-step process, I always want to go step 1, step 2, step 3, and I'm done. Once you create that perfect world scenario, then you have the ability to go in and create the possible outcomes because we know you can't always make sure everything's a perfect world every single time. Maybe I'm on step 1, I go to step 2, something happens and I have to go back to step 1. I can create an outcome that pushes me back a step if something got missed, if I need to repeat something. In the same aspect, those outcomes, when I go from step 1 and I finish it, maybe depending on what happened, I can either go to step 2, step 3, or step 4. All right, so you can have an outcome that skips other steps as well, because maybe not every step is necessary. So again, you want to think of all the possible outcomes for each of your steps and what direction you can go depending on what happens. All right, so there's a few questions that we like to ask as we're whiteboarding out our process. And so the whiteboarding questions, we like to say, what are our steps we need to take? Well, in the instance of maybe you're doing something around a meeting, I need to prep for the meeting, I need to execute the meeting, and I need to follow up on the meeting. Those are 3 different places of my process around that one meeting. Those are my steps. And then underneath that, even though my step 1 is prep for the meeting, what are the tasks? What are the actual items that I need to accomplish to make sure that all the preparation is done? Same thing, what are all the items I need to do to make sure the execution is done for step 2? And then also, what are all the items I need to make sure is done once I do the follow-up? All right, so again, you could have multiple tasks that are actually pushing for your step to be completed and move forward. After you create your steps and your tasks, then you go back to the top and you think, what could the outcomes be for each step? Because your outcomes are set up on the step level. It's not per task. So if I don't get a task done, I don't get to choose an outcome for that. It's specifically on the step level. So for instance, if I'm on step 1 and I'm prepping for the review meeting, I need to think of what are the possibilities that could happen. Well, if I'm prepping, maybe the client cancels before the meeting happens. Well, that can take me in a different direction, or maybe they reschedule. So my due dates need to change. I need to push to a different step. Or maybe all the prep is completed and then I can move from step 1 to step 2. My biggest suggestion in regards to outcomes is that you always want an outcome that pushes you to the next step in line, the perfect world scenario. So step 1 is complete, move to step 2. And then another outcome that always gives you the ability to end the workflow at any given time. Because the outcomes are what determine, can you end the workflow now or do I need to wait till the end? Now, the reason we do that is because if you're halfway through the process and you need to end the workflow, if you don't have an outcome and you're on step 2 and you don't have an outcome that gives you the ability to end the workflow, my only other options are to complete the workflow all the way through, which isn't accurate. I don't want it to show that I completed everything, or I can delete the workflow, which I don't want to do either. I want to show that I've done some sort of prep work or part of that process. So again, the outcomes give you the ability to change the direction of your roadmap as you're going through, to end the workflow at any given time, or to continue on in the process. Now, again, those are the things you want to think about after. So you set up your steps and tasks, and then you decide what outcomes are for each step. And when I choose that outcome, what direction am I going? So these questions are really helpful when you're whiteboarding out your process. Another question, so a 5th question that you want to ask is, where is the target date? Now, the target date in workflows is what helps decide all of your due dates for your steps and your tasks. So here's a real basic outline. We have step 1, step 2, and step 3. Again, we talked about it as based around a meeting. So step 1 is preparation, step 2 is execution, and step 3 is follow-up. So as soon as I get step 1 done, I need to know, but when do I need to do step 1? Well, that is all based off of the target date. And so you can decide where your target date is. In this case, it's in the middle of my workflow. It's the same day as the meeting. So I can set my due dates for that step a certain amount of days, weeks, or months before the target date. On step 2, I can set my target date to be the same day of the target date. And then maybe my follow-up needs to be due 3 days after. And so the target date is very specific to help with those automatic due dates. So I know when I need to complete step 1, step 2, and step 3. It's all based around that target date. All right, so I can't always say the target date is always going to be April 15th. You know, maybe that's going to change. Maybe in some cases for scheduling a meeting, if I can't always decide it's always going to be 2 weeks away, it's always going to be the same day as the meeting if the process is based around the meeting. But there's other types of processes you can set up as well. So in this case, we have our seminar event up in the top here. So our seminar event checklist where you can have 3 steps that are leading up to a due date. So maybe step 3 is due a day before the target date. Step 2 is due 2 weeks before the target date. And step 1 is due a month before the target date. So your target date can always be at the end, everything working up to it. Or you have down here the marketing campaign where the target date is the very first thing, step 1. Maybe we add a contact in and then I need to do tasks that are due the same day as the target date. Then step 2 takes place a week after. And then step 3 is due a month after. So depending on how your process is and where the important due date is, the important date, like it's a very important date is what the target date is, everything is based around it. Or even over on the right-hand side, we have our to-do list, this checklist. Maybe it's just a one-step workflow where everything is due on one day. All right, so it's step 1, and we have to get these 8 tasks accomplished, and that's all it is. So workflows don't always have to be super complicated with multiple steps. You can have just a one-step workflow and build it from there. So I just need to get these items done and then move forward. Now, when you're thinking about what are the possible processes I can set up, we have these. So it's some common workflow processes, things like a client review, a client meeting. I'm going to move if you see my picture up on here, I'm going to move it over here. The client review, client meeting, onboarding meeting, maybe money movement, a newsletter workflow, holiday correspondences. Even you can set up workflows to do with your compliance. A new employee, you have a new hire, someone added to the office, and you have a process they go through to learn everything for their specific job. If a client becomes deceased, you have a process you can build around changing their status so you make sure that you get all of the paperwork update that you need to. Event planning, all different types of business procedures. So you want to think about what workflows do I want to build? Essentially are the repeatable processes that you do over and over in the same way in your database. All right, so today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be whiteboarding out 3 different workflows. The first one we're calling just important info. The main reason for this workflow is to make sure that I have all of the important information that I need for a new prospect that I add into the database. So anytime I add a prospect record, I'm going to start this workflow and I'm going to make sure that I get certain tasks accomplished, like things like adding their phone number or adding their email address, tax ID. I can create a very simple workflow for that. The second one we're going to whiteboard out is a client onboarding. Now, this one isn't particularly taking place around a meeting. It's taking place once I change them from a prospect to a client. I'm going to start this workflow of certain items that I'm going to do after they change from a prospect to a client. I'm going to make sure I get certain paperwork done. I'm going to maybe send a welcome letter, different tasks that need to be accomplished as soon as I change a client from prospect to a client. And then the third one we're going to do is a little more complex where it's based around a client meeting. So anytime I schedule a client meeting, I'm also going to start my client meeting workflow. So that way I can do all of the prep, execution, and follow-up specifically for that meeting. All right, so I've already whiteboarded these out, sketched them out. I'm going to re-whiteboard them with you guys today, and I'm actually going to do that in Word. All right, so again, we're not going into the CRM today. The actual building process of adding these into the system is going to be in next week's webinar. And then after that is the third week is going to be running the process. So actually how it looks when you run it in the system. And our fourth video is going to be about automating all these processes so they happen without you having to do everything manually. And so in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to start with the important information workflow. And so in this case, I want to think of what are the actual tasks I need to get accomplished. So again, anytime I add a prospect into my database, I want to start this workflow so then I can actually have different tasks and add them into the system. And so in this case, I want to make sure that I have, let's call it important information. All right, and so here, what I'm going to start writing the different tasks. Let's say I want to get, let's see, the contact addresses. I also want to get phone numbers. We'll say I need to make sure their date of birth, tax ID. So essentially any item that you want to make sure, these are the different tasks. I want to make sure I get the addresses, the phone numbers, date of birth, the tax ID. Maybe I also want to put in referral source. Like these are important. Oh my goodness, you guys are looking at my horrible writing. There we go. Referral, and I can't even talk today, source. There we go. So again, you just go through and jot down, these are the items I need to get. And so again, this is just a one-step workflow. We're just doing one step, which is essentially gathering all the information for a new prospect. And then I'm going to create a task for each of those items. And so once you have this, now these are just simple items. You're probably going to have more that you're going to build into this because each office runs different. That's the great benefit of building your own workflows. And so for here, I can say these are my different tasks, and I'm going to name it a step. And so we'll call this step gather contact info. I'm going to put it in all caps, and then let's actually underline it so we know that's our step. All right. So our step is going to be called gather contact info. And then we have our contact addresses, phone numbers, date of birth, tax ID, referral source. Those are the actual items that I want to make sure I have in the database every time I add a contact. Now, also in this case, I want to determine, hey, when do I need these done by? So if I actually add them into the database, how soon do I want to get this information? So normally on the step level, I come and decide, well, I want this to be due, maybe if the target date is day 1 when I add them, maybe I want this to be due a week after I add them. So it gives myself a full week to make sure I get these items accomplished. So I'm just going to put, and this is based off the target date, I'm going to say due 1 week after target date. Simple enough. It's just a note on the step level because the step is due based off of the target date, which means that all these tasks, and again, let's say for instance that today is, I think the 4th. So today is the 4th. If I add in a contact for a prospect today, this step is going to be due next Thursday, so 1 week later. That's how I'm setting this up in my mind. Now, when you go through here, you can then choose like what you want your outcomes to be based on the step. So for here, I can say my step, and these are just possible outcomes. Maybe I've decided there's 2 options. I need to just end the workflow because maybe they decided they're not a prospect, we're removing it for some reason. And I also need to move forward, which is completing. Now, because it's just one step, both outcomes are going to have the same result. Either I complete it or I cancel it. And so those are my 2 outcomes that I'm creating. And so I'll go ahead and put, for outcome for 1 is going to be end workflow. So at any given time, if I just want to end the workflow, you can even just name it end workflow. And when you create these in the system, which again, we're going to show you next week, you choose from the dropdown the available steps. So the second item of if I end the workflow, what do I want to do next? It gives me all the available steps, which in this case is just one of gather contact info or complete workflow is what it will say. So again, this is just the whiteboarding. This is going to make a little more sense next week when we're showing it in the database and how you create that. But that's one option. The other option of what I want to do, and we'll just say the second outcome, I can complete. And you can call this, I'm just going to call it information gathered. Because that's actually what happened. If I completed all of these tasks, well, the information was gathered, and that still wants to move me forward to complete the workflow. Okay, So again, this is just a very simple one-step workflow. My step name is gather the contact info, which is going to be due 1 week after the target date. And then underneath that is I have, here's the individual tasks that I need to make sure that get accomplished. Once those are done, it then asks me what happened during this step. And I've decided in my template, I can either end the workflow if for some reason we need to stop that process at any given time, or the information was gathered. And both options give me the ability to just complete the workflow at that given time. All right, so again, for that, it's just a very simple, and we're going to add that into the database next week. Another one that we're going to build out, I'm going to go down here a little bit, is we're going to do a workflow based on anytime I change a contact from a prospect to a client. I have this simple workflow where I actually want tasks to happen based on them now a client. Maybe I want to set their category. I want to set their client review date. Maybe I want to set up what their keywords are going to be, their user-defined fields. All these different things in the database that I want to make sure get accomplished and that client profile gets set up correctly. I'm going to set that up here. So in this case, again, what we're going to do is start building out those tasks first. So anytime I add a contact, I want to make sure that we set the category. All right. I always want a category for all of my active clients. Maybe I also want to set the client review date. We can say we're going to update the keywords. You know, these are all different items that I want to make sure accomplish. Now, most of these are going to be Redtail related items that I'm putting in, but keep in mind, as you're building out your process, they might be things outside of Redtail, but you still want to use Redtail to make sure those items get accomplished. You can create a task for that. And maybe I also want to put add DL info. So the driver's license info, I want to make sure if they're a client of mine, I need to have their driver's license information. If you scan the driver's license, things like that, you can put all that information into your task to make sure they get accomplished and assign them out to people. Oh, also maybe we send a welcome letter. All right, so again, those are the tasks. Other things outside, maybe I need to send or create contact in the planning software. All right, so that's another task that I want to set up. And maybe I have to send the client paperwork. The biggest thing that I want you to remember is that your tasks, when creating them, should always start with a verb. If it's not starting with a verb, it's not actually telling you to do something. So you'll see, like, I need to set the category, I need to update the keywords, I need to send client paperwork. Those are all starting with verbs. Because if it doesn't start with the verb, it's not telling you to do something, and then it's no longer an actual task. You want to be very specific with what your tasks are telling you to do. All right, other items is maybe I like to send a 1 month update. So send 1 month update. So maybe after they become a client, we send them something a month later. So I can make that a task as well. And also maybe we like to call to schedule a phone meeting. You know, I can put that too. Call. Okay, so any task. Now I have this list of tasks now, but they all get done on different days possibly. So this is where I set up the different steps, like what actually gets accomplished around the same time doesn't have necessarily have an order. So in this case, I can look at my task and I say, well, you know, these items of like setting the category, setting the review date, sending the welcome letter, those I want to happen one of the first things, you know, so those are always on day one. And so what I'm going to do is just put a space. And then I have right here, well, actually the client contact and planning software, I can do the same day, possibly send the client the paperwork, all that, you know, that actually can all gather in the same place. So set the category, all of these is going to be one step. Well, then right here, I have one that send 1 month update, but that necessarily can't happen till a month later. So in that case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put the space here. And so that'll be our second step. So we have step 1, which has all of these tasks. And then step 2 right here, which is going to happen a month later. So remember, the steps have different due dates. Earlier, we just had 1 step. So what I'm going to do for step 1 is let's just call this update client record or contact record. So I'm creating the step now for those different tasks. Again, I'm just going to underline it. Actually, I'll make it bold too. So we know that is the actual step. And then for this one, we can say, we'll do just client update call or just client update. You know, we can call it whatever you want. This is just, we're actually updating the client, and we can actually do /call. Put whatever you want because you get to name these steps. We'll underline that, bold it, so we know that's a step. Now, when do these things need to get accomplished? Well, in that case, back onto the step level, I want this to happen, let's say on the target date. Do on target date. Because in this case, when we're whiteboarding this out, when we add the contact and change them to client, that's going to be our important day, the day they become a client, and then everything is happening a certain amount of days, weeks, or months after that actual change. So step one, I want all these items to be to the same day that we change them to a client. Down here for step two, well, I do a 1 month call, and maybe I call to schedule that meeting a month later as well. So I can put this, do 1 month after target date. So I know that those are going to be due a month after the target date. Now, what we need to do is set up our outcomes. And so for that, and actually I'm going to indent this because this is going to be, we'll call this our client onboarding workflow. All right, so that's the actual name of the workflow. And then we have our steps. Now we need to choose what are the outcomes for that. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to write step one outcomes again. So that's what we have. And what are the possibilities? Well, if they become a client, maybe for some reason they cancel, for some reason they decide not to become a client, things happen. We always want to give ourselves an out. So in this case, you can just call it end workflow, or you can put client canceled, or client declined. However you want to label these outcomes, you can. In this case, I'm just going to give a blanket option to end the workflow at any given time. So I'm going to call it for the first outcome, I'm going to just say it's going to be called end workflow. And if that happens, I want it to complete the workflow. Now, the second option for my outcome is that we've updated the contact. We've added all this information. So I can put client updated. And if the client's updated, I actually want to update them a month later. And again, so I'm going to choose from the step names, which this one is going to push to client update /call, because that's the name of the step we want to push to, which is step two. So again, during step one, if I accomplish everything, I'll choose the outcome for client updated, which pushes me to the client update call. And if for some reason I need to end the workflow, I have an outcome option that will just complete the workflow at any given time. Now I'm going to scroll down, do the same thing for this step. What are my possible outcomes? Well, let's say for instance that the only thing that could happen is I have updated them and either I schedule a phone call or I don't schedule a phone call. But either way, depending on if they don't want to schedule, I just want to end the workflow. Now again, maybe you want to build on this and you create a step 3 that reaches out for another phone call. You can build on and on to these processes, keep them as simple or as complex as you want. My biggest suggestion is to always keep them as simple as you can first and then build on them from there. So now for our step 2 outcomes, I'll write that here. The first one we're going to say is client updated, call scheduled. So I'm going to client updated, call is scheduled. That's actually what happened during step 1. And if that happens, I want to complete the workflow. Now the second option is client was still updated, no call scheduled. So I can still put client updated, no call scheduled. Because maybe they didn't want to schedule a call, or maybe something else, or maybe the meeting happened, but I'm still going to have an outcome. You can have 2 different outcomes that do the same result like we're doing here, because this is still going to complete our workflow. All right, so again, and this is a very simple client onboarding. Anytime we change a client from prospect to client, we start this workflow where we're going to have step one do on the day that we've changed them to get all of these tasks accomplished. And if that actually works and we move forward, it's then going to push to client update, where we're going to send them a 1 month update and call to schedule a phone meeting, which again is 1 month after that target date is when that due date will be. And then depending on if they call or if they schedule or don't schedule, we have outcomes to complete the workflow. So when you choose your outcome, it'll also give you the ability to make notes, and we will demonstrate how that looks in part 3 when we're running the workflow as well. So when you choose an outcome and then how you can add those notes in will be demonstrated in part 3 of the series. All right, now we're going to build one more, and I'm actually going to page down to another page here so we don't run out of room. And this one we're going to do is we'll do a client meeting. So I'm just going to call it client meeting workflow. We'll bold it here. That's going to be our name. And now for this, what we want to do is what are the different tasks? Now our client meeting one is normally based around the actual meeting day, which is our execution day. When you create your steps, you can have steps due before, during, or after that meeting. You don't always have to have steps and tasks due on the meeting. It's not necessary because that's what the actual activity is for. So in this case, I'm going to do a prep step, a second prep step, and then a follow-up step. So I'm going to do 2 different things. In my first prep step, I've decided that for any client meeting, I need to run a notes report, I need to run an email report, and run a planning accounts report from the planning software. Those are things I need to do normally, maybe let's say like a week or a few days before the actual meeting, have everything prepped for it. So for that, let's do, we're going to run the notes report. I don't want it to be bold anymore. There we go. I'm going to say run notes report, run email report. And again, they're all starting with verbs, and run planning software account report. Again, every action that you need to do that you make sure it gets assigned to somebody and accomplished, those are those tasks. Also, I want to make sure and confirm the meeting. So we're going to put that in there. That's essentially like, let's say all the prep that I want to do for this particular workflow. Now I also want to think about follow-up. And I already know these items are going to be follow-up items, so I'm going to put them here. I want to add the client meeting notes. All right, so that'll be one of my follow-up items. I also want to, let's say, make and record the adjustments. And even for things that might not be for everything, you can put in, if needed. I still want that in my task, but if it's not needed, I can like delete it out of the current active one. But you can put in if needed. It's normally better to put in extra tasks that might not be used every time than have to remember to add them later. Again, like if you don't need to do something, you can just remove it once the workflow is active. And again, that'll all be demonstrated in part 3. And then maybe I also want to do a follow-up call. All right, so these are my different steps and tasks, or my tasks that I need to get accomplished, everything based around a meeting. And again, I'm starting very simple here. I'm going to do prep, confirm, and follow-up. Prep, confirm, follow-up. Those are my steps. So for here, I can separate these out, and you'll see my first prep step. And let's call this meeting prep. All right, it's bold. We're going to underline it because it's one of our steps. This one will be, we can call it confirmation. Now, it's important to remember, even if you have one task, you still need, or just one task, the step is not actually telling you who's assigned. So if you have one step with one task, normally those can actually be named the same thing. I can call it confirm meeting and the task confirm meeting. Or again, you can change it, confirmation, confirm meeting, the task is telling me what needs to happen. And then add client meeting notes, all this is gonna be follow-up, and I'm just gonna call this meeting follow-up. And we'll make that our step. Okay, so now we can see this forming. We have meeting prep, confirmation, meeting follow-up. Those are the different aspects based around our actual meeting day that we're having with the client, so everything gets accomplished. Now I need to decide, when are those going to happen? Well, the meeting prep, I want to give myself a week before the meeting. So I can say this is going to be due 1 week before the target date. The confirmation, I want to give myself a day. I'm going to confirm the day before the meeting. And so I can say due 1 day before target date. And then the follow-up, I'm going to give myself 3 days. So I can say due 3 days after target date. So I'm trying to visualize where the important date is, which is my meeting, and when these things need to get accomplished. So meeting prep, I have a week to accomplish. Once that's done, the day before, I'm going to confirm the meeting. And then when I follow up on the meeting, I have 3 days to get that accomplished. Now for each step, I need to decide what are the possible outcomes that can happen. Now for step 1, and we're going to put step 1 outcomes. I've decided there's 3 possible outcomes that can happen. If my workflow is started, I can say, well, the prep is complete and it's going to move us forward to the next step. Or the client cancels. At that point, if I started some prep, I don't want to just delete the workflow. I'm going to complete it at that step. Or the client reschedules. And if they reschedule, I still want to mark that in my workflow, and we're just going to restart the step we're on. So also keep in mind, an outcome can just repeat the step you're currently on. So you have a process of, I started and completed this step, but then had to immediately repeat it. So in this case, the first outcome is prep is going to be complete. Everything's done. And if I choose that, it's going to move forward to confirmation. So that's our perfect world scenario. Remember, the outcome can only ever go to another step that's created in your actual process. Now, the second outcome, I can say, well, the client cancels. Maybe at any given point they cancel this meeting, I want the ability to complete the workflow. And then this one's going to have a third option. The third outcome is going to be the client reschedules. And if they reschedule, we are going to restart step 1, which is meeting prep. All right, so step 1, we have our outcomes. Either they prep is complete, client cancels, or they reschedule. For the confirmation, I'm actually reaching out. I need to get an answer. And again, either they can cancel, they can reschedule, or they can confirm the meeting. So those are my 3 outcomes, because when you call someone and you're confirming, you can essentially say, these are the possible outcomes of this scenario. So we'll put step 2 outcomes. And we'll say the first one is meeting confirmed. And if the meeting's confirmed, we're going to move forward, and we want that to go to our third step of meeting follow-up. All right. Now, for the second possible outcome, I can say during the confirmation, they cancel. They just want to cancel the meeting, so I can say client cancels. And if that happens, I just want to complete the workflow. All right, at any given time, I have the ability to complete my workflow on any given step. And then the third option is they reschedule. So client reschedules. And if they reschedule, I want to go back to step 1, because we're going to re-prep for that meeting. And so we're going to say meeting prep. So now we can see if the meeting is confirmed, we go forward in our process, perfect world scenario. If they cancel, it's going to complete this workflow and end it. And if the client reschedules, we're going to restart back at step 1, because then all the due dates have changed. Maybe we need to redo our notes, our planning software report, things change. So we want to go back to that step. Now, lastly, our last step here, step outcomes, we'll do step 3 outcomes, is I've decided either the follow-up is complete, which is super simple, ends our workflow, or maybe something in the paperwork wasn't in good order and I want to go all the way back to the beginning. So those are my 2 options. So either follow-up complete or paperwork NIGO, not in good order. And so for here, let's do 1 is going to be follow-up complete. And we can say that's going to complete the workflow. Or that we're going to, that paperwork, NIGO, not in good order, and that's going all the way back to meeting prep, because maybe we're going to reach out, schedule them again, and start this workflow process over again. All right, so I know it seems like a lot. Whiteboarding is a lot. We just went through 3 different processes. And just to go through those one more time, I'm going to go back up to the top. We whiteboarded out, and actually let me bold this, is our important information workflow, which is a 1-step workflow. When it starts, we have a week to accomplish getting all of the contact information, date of birth, tax ID in that contact record, so we have good, clean data in our database. After that, we have our client onboarding workflow, which gets triggered when I start, take a prospect and change them to a client. I start this workflow. I have the same day to make sure that I set up their contact, and again, for good, clean data in the database. And then I have a month to make sure that I get their 1-month update call done, and I call to schedule a phone meeting later on. So maybe we like to update them, you know, do like a 6-month call, however you want, but just it happens after the target date, and then that gets completed. The third one we did was our client meeting workflow. So we did a meeting prep step, a confirmation step, and a meeting follow-up step. And all of those made sure that we got all of our prep completed, we confirm the meeting, and then all of our follow-up. So we make sure that everything happens the same way for every single one of our client meetings. Now, again, going back, there's so many different possibilities for workflows that you can do. The biggest thing I can suggest when starting is, again, whiteboard with everyone who's involved in the process. Everybody sits down, talks about that process, see what your tasks are going to be. And again, use a whiteboard, use a blank piece of paper. You can even use Post-it notes. I've seen people just take Post-it notes, and every task that they have, they write on a Post-it note, and they can move those Post-it notes together and group them in the steps they belong. But it's really important to have something written down. So when you go into, like next week, when we go into building the workflow, you know what your end goal for your processes are going to be. So that's really important to make sure that you have your roadmap built out so that you don't actually go in the wrong direction. You know where you're going from start to finish, and these processes will really help and boost your actual business.
Thanks so much for joining us today for this particular session. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to give us a call at 800-206-5030, option 3 for support, or just shoot us an email over to support@redtailtechnology.com. Thanks a lot and have a great day.